Well, on the one hand, I think it's helpful, really, that there are a few particularly strong parties, because this means that you don't have a fractious, fragmented, quarreling parliament that's composed of highly unstable coalitions that are constantly, where political parties are constantly tempted to break up, break away, form new coalitions, etc. And I think since Egypt is moving into a period where it has to negotiate some very important issues that will shape the nature of Egypt in the future, especially relationships, the relationship of the civilian authorities with the armed forces. Having a few strong parties in parliament means that their ability to negotiate both with the armed forces and with each other in order to formulate what they see as, the necessary relationship on that, as on social policy or as on economic policy, is going to be aided in this transitional phase. The sort of flip side of that, of course, is that if there is one particularly strong party, in this case the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, there's always the risk that if it feels that it can do anything it wants, then it may become somewhat autocratic and ram through legislation or policies that disadvantage other groups. And so the critical question really is whether there are strong opposition forces within Parliament or outside Parliament that learn the democratic lessons of fighting for themselves, of fighting for certain rights. In other words, democracy is not just about acquiring a majority and earning the right to take office. It's actually just as much about the people who've lost in the elections learning also to operate within the system and to continue challenging the majority. Democracy arises out of that contestation and out of both sides learning how to tolerate and respect their limits and the rights of the others. My sense is that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces in Egypt wants to hand power over to civilians. I think that is very definite. I think they've had a very hard time over the last 11 months or so of governing Egypt, of taking decisions on key issues to do with the economy, with social relations, with how to deal with demonstrations and what to do with the police force, among other things. And they found it extremely difficult to both maintain a correct balance and to take decisions on these matters where, for instance, funding is short, the economy has suffered. They don't have answers for these things. And so in a way, I think they're going to be very relieved to hand over responsibility for these things back to civilian authorities that can then take all the blame. However, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the ruling military council, also wishes to secure its own particular interests and privileges in the future. On the one hand, in foreign policy, the armed forces are keen to preserve the peace with Israel, and that's partly linked up to wanting to preserve US foreign military assistance, which runs to $1.3 billion a year. The Supreme Council is unwilling to risk that. So they don't want to hand power over to civilians who actually then have the power to tear up the peace treaty with Israel or to go to war, for instance, or whatever. They don't want to allow that sort of power in the hands of civilians. Nor do they want civilians to have full oversight and scrutiny of the defense budget, because at the moment it's under exclusive military control. No one knows what the money is spent on, how it's spent, etc. The military run a number of economic enterprises and businesses, which they also don't account for. And they have other types of discretionary funds and income streams. And they want also to preserve their exclusive control and to keep this non-transparent to civilians. And they're trying to work out a deal in which they will continue to enjoy these particular exclusions from civilian oversight in the future, whether by writing this into the Constitution or maybe by having a role in nominating the next president, or in somehow ending up with a president who's amenable to their pressure and to their preferences. Presidential election is important because if the Egyptian armed forces are to retain ultimate veto power over issues of war and peace and foreign policy on the one hand, and if they're to maintain their exclusive control over their budgets and funding streams and so on, then either that is to be written into the Constitution as permanent formal rights and privileges, or they need a president who's sympathetic to them, if not under their control, and who will use his presidential power in order to ensure that no other civilians get involved in military affairs, which is pretty much what the situation was under the previous president, Hosni Mubarak, where the military knew they could leave it to him, he would protect them, and in return, of course, they were loyal to him. How the military is to ensure that in future the president will in fact always be someone sympathetic to them or under their control is a very big challenge. It's not obvious. They can do it this time. How are they going to do it in future? It's not really evident. The international community, I think, faces a dilemma because most of the time, the way in which, say, the United States exercises influence in these situations, besides sort of private discussions and encouragement, is usually to offer or threaten to withdraw financial assistance. And this is an extremely crude and blunt instrument that more often backfires than serves its purpose. So if the US was to try and assist, or if the rest of the Western countries, the OECD community, the European Union, if they were to try and assist democratic transition, I think making further financial assistance, economic assistance, either for the armed forces in Egypt or for the economy, conditional on certain behavior, I think that's not going to work. Because although the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces is absolutely adamant about protecting its special relationship with the US military and with US military assistance, I think if the assistance is presented in the form of, well, we will give this to you only if you do the following, and we're going to now cut it off to force you to do the following, I think then the Egyptian armed forces would resist that. And they'd pay they'd be willing to pay the price it takes, because they would then gain on the domestic front of having stood up to this sort of blackmail. That, I think, wouldn't be useful. So the real challenge, I think, for the outside players, the US, the EU, and others, is to, I think, instead set, as it were, a goal, the ultimate goals, that a genuine democratic transition should end in a situation where the armed forces completely accept civilian oversight, which means scrutiny of the defense budget and scrutiny of any other economic or financial activities or streams they have, and also where the armed forces obey the orders of the government, the duly constituted government, where necessary ratified by presidential decree or parliamentary decree or whatever it may be. Now, to get to that point is going to be a very difficult, protracted process in Egypt. But if the outside players make it very clear to the armed forces that this is what is expected, this is what has to be at the end of the line, then this may also encourage the Egyptian political parties to stand firm and to say to the armed forces, as for instance the Muslim Brotherhood has been saying repeatedly, it is unacceptable and inconceivable that there should not be proper civilian oversight and parliamentary scrutiny of the defense budget in the future. This has to happen. There can't be permanent immunity of the armed forces from whatever they do inside the country. These things have to change. We may offer immunity for past behavior or past problems and mistakes, but not for future ones. And they, I think, will stand firm if they also feel that an important player like the US or the EU also support this position. Because the Egyptian armed forces then understand that this is the real US position, because in the last year that hasn't been the real US position. And so the armed forces, I think, have been encouraged to think that they can actually exercise more influence and more leverage over the civilian politicians, basically saying, okay, we are going to hand over power, but you're going to have to pay a price for this. If they feel that that is a useless game, then they may back down more easily and with less cost. The constitutional declaration, as it's called, that was issued by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces at the end of March 2011, which followed only 1 week or so after a referendum had approved a revised constitution already. I mean, it was a rather strange exercise. But in any case, the armed forces laid out how the new constitution is to be drafted. And this was specifically to set up a technical committee, a drafting committee of 100 people who would be selected and appointed by Parliament, the new incoming Parliament. Now, the problem is that last fall, around, say, October, November, as it became obvious that the Muslim Brotherhood and maybe other parties, such as the Noor Party, which is a Salafi Islamist party, were likely to do very well in the elections, the armed forces started to retreat under pressure from some of the secular liberal parties and from non-liberal parties, secular parties that basically don't want regime change, they don't want anything to change, and they hope that the military will stay on in power to ensure that they too will always benefit from the future system. So these different types of pressures came in, and the armed forces tried to issue a new document governing the constitutional process in which Parliament would only select 20 of the 100 members of the Constitution Drafting Committee, and that no single party could appoint more than 5 people to represent it among those 20. So even if, say, the Muslim Brotherhood controlled 50% of Parliament, which should give it 10 out of 20 seats in the Constitutional Committee, it would only be entitled to 5. The other 80 representatives in the Constitutional Drafting Committee would represent a wide range of government and non-government sectors, lawyers, engineers, university teachers, workers' unions, farmers' unions, etc. And these were to be nominated by these various unions or their governing bodies. Now, a lot of these bodies and unions, the Council or Assembly of Universities, for instance, in Egypt, were mostly people who had been appointed by the previous regime of Hosni Mubarak, or were going to be reappointed by the new executive authority, in other words, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. So this became a very blatant attempt by the Supreme Council to stack the Constitutional Committee with their nominees. In other words, they were going to make sure that no matter what happened in the parliamentary elections or the elections for the Senate, the Shura Council, this would have next to no bearing on the Constitution drafting, which of course was a fundamentally undemocratic process. It's fine to say we have to make sure that the new Constitution doesn't go all the other way just because there happens to be a parliamentary majority these days who are Islamist or socialist or whatever it might be. That's fair enough. But their attempt was quite blatant and triggered the protests of November that finally forced them to backtrack and take that document off the table. It may come back on the table, however. I think in terms of the democratic transition specifically, what is really important is to shift the relationship between people who possess political power by virtue of holding public office or by virtue of sitting in senior positions in the state bureaucracy, where they have a lot of control and influence over economic decision making, who gets what contracts, who gets the biggest contracts, who gets special access to credit or capital, for instance. So long as that was the state under Mubarak in Egypt, this meant that his cronies, very big businessmen, people who were close to Mubarak, the president, close to maybe the leading circle of the National Democratic Party, which was headed partly by Mubarak's son, Gamal, that these people got the biggest contracts and they got privileged access. The state in Egypt still accounts for a lot of expenditure and spending on infrastructure, construction, and so on, or controlled a lot of the dealerships in commerce, in trade, and so on, of the big brands, etc. So they could give these to their privileged cronies. Now, as long as that happened, small and medium businessmen in Egypt weren't going to invest or expand. There wasn't any predictability. They couldn't be sure that their rights and contracts would be respected. If they got big enough, then some political big personality or some senior bureaucrat would then muscle in and say, well, if you're going to get an even bigger share of this market, you're going to start expanding, we want our share too. You've got to let us in on this. Now, as long as that's the case, the small and medium business class in Egypt will never grow. And the thing is, in a country like Egypt, as in much of the developing world, It's the small and medium business class that account for the largest single number of individual businesses and of employees and owners. Big business tends to be much more concentrated. And so the sort of the rise of a very large business class that is committed to free market economics, that's committed to private sector enterprise, and to genuine competition, genuine openness and transparent sort of rules of the game, as it were, is going to be blocked. So it's fundamentally important in the case of Egypt for democratic transition for this relationship to shift. And then maybe we'll end up where, say, Turkey has ended up, where the growing middle class grew so much that it finally could challenge the rule of the military and backed the sort of political party that was interested in challenging the military and rolling back military power and pushing them out of political life.